Welcome to another deep dive. We're going through a student's dictionary of psychology and neuroscience today and picking out some good stuff. We want to look at some of the things in here that might change the way you see the world, or even just yourself.
Yeah, sounds good.
So have you ever had one of those aha moments, like when you've been working on a tough problem and then all of a sudden the solution just hits you?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That's exactly what we're talking about here. Like when the pieces all click into place, that's the aha experience.
Those moments were actually super important for the Gestalt psychologists.
Really?
Yeah, Gestalt psychology was all about how we perceive things as a whole, not just as individual parts. And those aha moments, they really highlight that.
Okay, that makes sense. So instead of just seeing a bunch of random pieces,
Mm.
our brains are trying to make sense of it all, trying to find the bigger picture.
Absolutely. Our brains are always looking for patterns and meaning. Like, think about when you're putting together a puzzle.
Hmm.
You don't just see a jumble of pieces, right? You see the image that they're supposed to form.
Right, right. You see the whole picture.
Exactly. So for Gestalt psychologists, these aha experiences were proof that our brains are wired for making those connections, for understanding the whole rather than just the parts.
So we're hardwired for meaning making. I like it.
Exactly. And speaking of making connections, that reminds me of another fascinating concept, latent learning.
Oh yeah, latent learning. What is that again?
Well, it's kind of like hidden learning. It's the idea that we can learn things without even realizing we're learning them. Yeah, there's this classic experiment by a guy named Tolman with rats in a maze.
I've heard of that one.
Have you?
Yeah, think so. They put the rats in a maze, but they didn't get any rewards for finding their way through.
Exactly. So no cheese or anything like that for these rats. They just wandered around, seemingly aimlessly.
So how did they learn anything then?
Well, that's the fascinating part. Even without any obvious incentive, even without realizing it, the rats were still learning the layout of the maze. They were forming a mental map.
Wow, so they were picking up on the information just by being in the maze, even though they weren't consciously trying to.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, this latent learning, it can actually influence our behavior later on.
You mean like we might not even know we've learned something until we need to use that information?
Precisely. It's like our brains are constantly absorbing information from our surroundings, filing it away for later, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
Huh. That's pretty wild. It makes you wonder what kind of stuff we're learning without even realizing it, right? Like, what if we're all secretly fluent in another language, just waiting for the right moment to burst out?
Well, maybe not fluent in another language, but you never know.
Huh, true. But seriously, I bet there's a lot of stuff we learn just by observing and interacting with the world around us. Like, think about social skills or even just picking up on subtle cues in our environment.
Absolutely. It's like our brains are always working in the background, making connections, forming associations, even when our conscious mind is busy with other things.
And this all ties back into memory, right? I mean, those experiences, even the ones we don't consciously remember, they leave some kind of trace in our brains.
That's right. And that brings us to the concept of the memory trace.
Oh, tell me more about that.
So imagine a memory trace, like a footprint left in the sand. Every experience we have, every piece of information we encounter, it leaves a mark, a trace in our brain.
Okay, so even if we forget the experience itself, the memory, that trace is still there.
Exactly. And even if we can't consciously recall a specific experience, that trace, that footprint in the sand, it can still subtly influence our thoughts and actions in the present.
Wow, so even our forgotten moments are still shaping us in ways we might not fully grasp. That's kind of a mind-blowing thought.
It is pretty amazing, isn't it? And it makes you wonder about the potential impact of all those hidden influences.
Yeah, like, what if some of those forgotten experiences are actually shaping our thoughts and behaviors in ways that we're not even aware of? That's kind of a scary thought.
It's definitely something to think about. And that actually leads us to another intriguing concept, implicit memory bias, which is basically, well, it's basically the idea that our memories, even the unconscious ones, can be biased, particularly towards negative experiences. Studies have shown that we tend to remember negative events more vividly and readily than positive ones.
Yeah, that does make sense when you think about it. I mean, those negative experiences, they often feel more intense, more, I don't know, memorable.
Right. It's like our brains are kind of hardwired to remember the things that might pose a threat, even if it means dwelling on the bad stuff sometimes.
Yeah, that makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint,
Right.
right? Like if our ancestors were walking around just focusing on the happy memories and ignoring all the potential dangers,
Yeah.
well, they probably wouldn't have lasted very long.
Exactly. So it makes sense that we've evolved to have this kind of negativity bias just to help us survive.
So even if we don't consciously remember those negative experience, those memory traces, they could still be shaping our thoughts and behaviors in the present.
Absolutely. It's like, imagine you're wearing a pair of sunglasses with a certain tint, right?
Okay.
Even if you forget you're wearing them, everything you see is still filtered through that lens, right?
Right.
So it's kind of like that with our past experiences, especially those with a strong emotional charge. They can color our perceptions and reactions in ways we might not even realize.
That's kind of wild. Our brains are constantly working behind the scenes to shape our reality, huh?
They really are. And it's not just through memories and biases either. The dictionary also talks about perceptual constancy.
Oh, yeah, perceptual constancy. What was that again?
Well, it's basically our brain's way of keeping our view of the world stable and consistent, even though the sensory information we're taking in is constantly changing.
Oh, right, right. Like when someone walks away from us, they don't actually shrink, even though the image they project on our retina gets smaller.
Exactly. That's size constancy. Our brains understand that their actual size remains constant, even if the visual information is changing. Or think about shape constancy. A door's still a door, whether it's open or closed, even though the shape we see changes.
So our brains are doing all this work to make these adjustments, to fill in the gaps, and create a seamless perception of reality for us.
Exactly. And you know what really highlights this active construction of reality? Visual
Oh
illusions.
yeah, illusions. I always love those. The dictionary talks about the Necker cube. You ever seen that one?
Oh, yeah, the Necker cube is a classic. It's just a simple line drawing of a cube, but it messes with your brain because you can see it in two different ways, with either the front or back face appearing closer.
Right. And your perception just flips back and forth between those two interpretations, even though the image itself doesn't change at all.
Exactly. It's like our brains are trying to make sense of the ambiguous image, so they just keep switching back and forth between different possibilities, looking for the most likely explanation.
It's like our brains are saying, I don't know what to believe.
Haha, right. But that's what I love about illusions. They really expose the limitations of our perceptual systems and how our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, even when the information we're getting is incomplete or contradictory.
Yeah, it's like our brains are playing tricks on us.
In a way, they are, but it's not really about trickery. It's more like they're trying to make the best of what they've got. We're not just passively watching the world go by. We're actively involved in constructing our own experience of reality.
That's a pretty wild thought. So let's see, where are we? We've talked about aha moments and how they show how our brains are always looking for connections and meaning. And then there's latent learning, that hidden learning that's happening all the time without us even realizing it.
Right. And we can't forget about memory traces, those little footprints of our past experiences that can stick around and shape our thoughts and actions, even without us consciously remembering them.
Yeah, and how sometimes those memory traces, they can even bias us towards remembering the negative stuff more than the positive stuff. Like our brains are wired for negativity or something, which I guess makes sense from like an evolutionary perspective, right?
Absolutely. It's all about survival, isn't it?
Right. So all of this, it paints a pretty complex picture of how our brains work, doesn't it? Like what we think of as reality is really just our own brain's best guess at what's going on, shaped by all these different factors, both conscious and unconscious.
Absolutely. And the more we understand about those factors, the better equipped we are to navigate the world around us.
That's a great point. Is like the more we understand about how our brains work, the more we can start to recognize our own biases and blind spots, and maybe even challenge them.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. Right.
Well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up for today, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We really have. So to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the incredible world of psychology and neuroscience. We hope you learned something new today. Until next time, keep those brains firing.